Gather close, traveller, and let your mind drift far from the thrones of Olympus, for this is not the tale of a god seated in the heavens, but of one who walked among men. This is what Zeus was up to when he wasn't ruling the skies, when he wasn't casting thunderbolts or commanding the other gods, but instead was worshipped in secret groves, summoned by rainmakers, feared in shadows, honored in feasts, and remembered in altars scattered across the mountains and markets of ancient Greece. If you've ever wondered how the king of gods moved quietly through the world below, then stay a while, and if the myths still speak to you, don't forget to like and subscribe to keep them alive. Zeus, the Olympian king, ruled high among the gods, and watched over the earth from the skies as the god of the heavens, the storms, and the winds, holding dominion over fate, justice, and moral order. From mountain peaks and hilltops, where clouds first gathered and thunder echoed loudest, the people lifted their eyes and prayers to him. It was in these lofty places that his sanctuaries were often built, where altars were raised and offerings made, especially in times of drought, when the rain-giving power of Zeus was most desired. Yet even far from these high places, in the humblest of homes, small shrines stood where families lit fires and gave thanks to Zeus, not only as a distant sky god, but also as a protector of hearth and kin. In ancient art and sculpture, Zeus was always portrayed as a mighty figure, bearded, muscular, and regal, with the strength of storms held within his body. His most familiar symbols were the thunderbolt he hurled, the royal scepter he carried, and the great eagle that soared at his side. Among the many representations of Zeus, one stood above all, the grand statue of Zeus at Olympia, created by the master sculptor Phidias. This immense work, fashioned of ivory and gold, radiated divine majesty, its Roman reproductions in marble and bronze preserving something of the awe it once inspired. The image of Zeus lived not only in stone and gold, but in words and traditions passed from poet to poet, from city to city. The Greek poet Callimachus once cried to the sea, begging a ship to return his beloved, invoking Zeus Limenoscopus, the watcher of havens, as guardian of all those who ventured far from shore. In another work by Philostratus, the house was a sacred place filled with the implements of divine worship, sacrificial baskets, firewood, barley, and sacred basins, all placed with care before the altar of Zeus Herchaeos, the guardian of household and family. Even words carried his presence, are recorded in the Suda, a great Byzantine lexicon, where entries explain the many forms in which Zeus was known. There was Zeus Palamnios, who brought punishment upon those who shed blood with their own hands, turning their guilt upon them. There was Zeus Teleos, honored beside Hera in the rites of marriage, as the sacred overseer of union and family. There was Zeus Senios, protector of hospitality and strangers, who watched over every guest welcomed into a home. Zeus Ctesios appeared again and again in domestic life, honored as the giver of wealth and food, his shrine often placed even within the store cupboards where he safeguarded the well-being of the household. The people gave names to the months in honor of Zeus, like Maimatrion, the stormy month that marked the onset of winter, when the winds howled and the skies shifted suddenly, reflecting the moody and unpredictable force of Zeus Maimaktes. In Athens, the great city of Attica, Zeus had many faces. In the heart of the city, in the agora where ideas and goods passed between citizens, the portico of Zeus Eleutherios stood, Zeus the Liberator, honored for freedom and protection. The traveler Pausanias, walking the streets of Athens, noted the images inside sacred buildings, where Zeus was remembered beside Athena, Memory, the Muses, and Apollo, each god part of a greater tapestry of meaning and reverence. Through all these images, names, and places, Zeus remained at the center, the Sky Father above, who gave justice with the thunder and ruled with a presence both feared and beloved. His worship was wide and deep, from the cold mountain tops where winds clashed, to the warm homes where children played, to the shrines built within cupboards where food and hope were stored. His many titles told the story of his reach. Limenoskopos, the Haven Watcher, Herkeos of the Hearth, Palamnios the Punisher, Teleos of Marriage, Xenios of Hospitality, and Ktesios of Domestic Wealth. Through time, through art and poetry, through storms and sunshine, Zeus remained the guardian of balance, the one who watched from above, whose thunder shook the earth, and whose justice bound both gods and mortals alike. Beside the royal portico in the ancient Kerameikos quarter of Athens, standing tall and commanding respect, there was a statue of Zeus, honored there under the name Zeus Eleuterios, the god of freedom. His presence marked a sacred place that held great importance for the people, a space tied to the ideals of liberty and autonomy, rooted deeply in Athenian life and politics. Nearby, within the council chamber, were the 500, the yearly group of Athenian councillors, gathered to deliberate and decide on matters of the city, stood another form of Zeus, this time known as Zeus Boulaios, the god of counsel. Crafted from wood, this statue stood beside others, including an image of Apollo created by the sculptor Perseus and a figure of the Demos, the personified spirit of the Athenian people, shaped by the hand of Lyson. These figures reflected the divine guidance believed to hover over the assemblies and decision-making of the Athenian democracy, connecting the gods with the everyday workings of the city. Elsewhere in Athens, powerful scenes were painted to commemorate their legendary victories, including depictions of the Athenians locked in battle against the warrior women known as the Amazons, shown in fierce combat. These depictions were not only painted on walls but also carved into the very symbols of their protection and power, engraved on the shield carried by their statue of Athena and on the pedestal that held up the towering figure of Zeus Olympios. This massive statue, dedicated in a later age by the Roman Emperor Hadrian, stood at the entrance of the great sanctuary of Zeus Olympios in Athens. The statue was an awe-inspiring sight, made from ivory and gold, immense in scale, nearly rivaling the great colossi of Rhodes and Rome, and made all the more remarkable for the fine craftsmanship despite its great size. Outside the temple, the emperor's likeness was honored too, with statues of Hadrian carved from Thasian and Egyptian stone. Bronze statues stood before the pillars of the temple, which the Athenians called their colonies, and within the large sanctuary that stretched about 4 stades around, statues filled the space. Cities from all across the land had come to dedicate their own images of Hadrian here, and the Athenians, not to be outdone, raised behind the temple a colossus more splendid than all the others. Inside the sanctuary grounds were many other ancient relics and sacred places. A bronze statue of Zeus could be seen there, along with a temple to Kronos and Rhea, and a special enclosure for Gaia, the earth, whom the Athenians called Olympus. Within this sacred place, the earth opened up to the width of a cubit, and the people believed that here was the place where the waters of the great flood, during the time of Deucalion, had drained away. Every year, as a ritual remembrance, they poured into this opening a mixture of wheat meal and honey. On a nearby pillar stood a statue of the famous orator Isocrates, and elsewhere in the sanctuary, statues of Persians carved from Phrygian marble were placed, supporting a bronze tripod, a curious and striking sight. The Athenians claimed that the original sanctuary of Zeus Olympios had been built by Deucalion himself, and they supported this tradition by pointing to what they said was his grave, situated not far from the newer temple. The Emperor Hadrian, in his deep admiration for Greek culture and reverence for the gods, had also built for the Athenians a temple shared between Hera and Zeus Panhellenios, the Zeus of all Greeks, symbolizing unity across the many cities and regions. Up on the Acropolis of Athens, amidst the statues and temples dedicated to the gods, there stood an image of Athena, rising from the very head of Zeus, a powerful reminder of her birth and of Zeus's divine authority. Nearby was another statue, this time of Gaia, the earth, kneeling in supplication before Zeus, hands raised, asking for rain to fall upon her dry soil. This moment captured in stone may have reflected a time when Athens itself suffered drought, or perhaps it echoed a time when all of Greece longed for water from the heavens. And as the visitors walked further across the heights of the Acropolis, they would come upon other statues of Zeus, including one made by the sculptor Leocharis and another known as Zeus Polios, the Zeus of the city. His worship involved specific sacrifices, performed according to ancient custom, rooted in the traditions of Athens and passed down through generations. Each image, each statue, each sacred name reflected not just the power and reach of Zeus, but also the many ways the Athenians wove him into the very fabric of their city, their politics, their land, and their weather. Through counsel and reign, through war and peace, in public places and private sanctuaries, Zeus was there, silent in form but always present, guiding the city with strength and law from above. Upon the sacred altar of Zeus Polios, located within the boundaries of Athens, a ritual unlike any other took place, a ceremony rooted deeply in ancient tradition and preserved over time with unwavering attention to the old ways. There, on the unguarded altar, the priest would place a mixture of barley and wheat, laying it gently upon the sacred stone. The ox, destined for sacrifice, was kept nearby, already chosen and prepared, and when the time came, it would approach the altar of its own will and begin to eat the grain placed there. This act, though silent, marked the beginning of the rite. One of the priests, bearing the title of the ox slayer, would then step forward and, in accordance with the ritual, strike down the ox. But once the act was done, the priest immediately cast away the axe, as if it were no longer in his possession, and fled the scene, leaving behind no trace of his identity. It was then that the other priests gathered solemnly, and as though unaware of who had performed the sacrifice, they conducted a trial, not for the man, but for the weapon. The axe was brought forth and placed on trial, judged for the death it had caused, and in this symbolic gesture, the community acknowledged the weight of the act, while distancing the human hand that carried it out. Before the entrance of the Erechtheion, another sacred structure in Athens, stood an altar to Zeus Hipparchus the Most High. At this altar, no living creature was ever sacrificed. Instead, offerings were made using cakes shaped and presented without blood, and not even wine was used in these quiet acts of worship. This gentle and peaceful offering reflected an ancient view of reverence, one that avoided taking life in honor of the highest God. The story of the ox slayer was remembered too in the court of the Prytaneum, the place where the Athenians tried inanimate objects. It was said that the tradition began when the axe used in that first sacrifice at the altar of Zeus Polios was put on trial. The ox slayer, having taken a life at the sacred place, left the weapon behind and went into exile, disappearing from the land while the axe remained. The people then judged the axe itself, And this strange but powerful ritual was carried out year after year, with each new generation repeating the trial as a mark of their heritage and the laws that bound them. In another part of Greece, in the region of Arcadia, there lived a king named Lycaon, and it was said that he lived during the time of Cecrops, the king of Athens. But while Cecrops was the first to call Zeus by the name Hypatos, recognizing him as the supreme god, and choosing to offer only cakes, burning them gently upon the altar in the form of pelanoi, Lycaon performed a terrible act. At the altar of Zeus Lycaos, he brought forth a human child and sacrificed it. This dark contrast between the two kings revealed the differences in how each understood reverence and the will of the gods. In later times, when the Gauls waged war against Greece, a brave Athenian named Cydias fought and fell in battle. After his death, his family took his shield and dedicated it to Zeus Eleutherios, the god of freedom. The inscription carved upon it spoke of the shield as the first that Cydias used when he went into battle, his left arm passing through its strap as he faced the fury of the enemy. The shield was more than just a weapon. It was a memory, a marker of courage, and a gift laid before Zeus in honor of the fallen warrior. This shield, along with others, remained on display at the porch of Zeus Eleutherios until the time when Sulla, the Roman general, seized the treasures of Athens and carried them away. Even the name Eleutherios held deep meaning, as explained in the old lexicon of the Byzantines. Some said the title came from the freedmen who built the portico near the temple of Zeus. Hyperides, a speaker of old, supported this view, but another, named Didymos, offered a different reason, that the title Eleutherios came not from freedmen, but from a greater act, the escape of the Athenians from Persian rule, a triumph of freedom preserved in divine honor. Beyond Athens itself, in the nearby town of Piraeus, once a thriving port and bustling center, there had been temples and statues too, but numerous wars had reduced it over time to a small settlement, leaving behind only scattered traces of the grandeur it once held. Yet even in this quieter place, the name of Zeus lived on, tied to the stories, the offerings, the rituals, and the symbols that continued to echo the power of the god who watched from above. The harbors of the land once held a temple dedicated to Zeus Soter, the god of safety and deliverance, a place where the sea met the sacred. Within its small roofed colonnades, paintings of remarkable beauty covered the walls, works created by the hands of famous artists whose names echoed through the ages. The paintings, admired for their precision and depth, brought color and life to the sacred space, while the open court beyond held statues standing proudly under the sun. These statues bore witness to devotion and craftsmanship, each figure crafted with care, placed there in honor of the god who protected those at sea and on land. In the port town of Piraeus, a significant sight drew attention: a shared precinct of Athena and Zeus. Here, bronze statues stood side by side, the figures gleaming under the light, each holding their own symbols. Zeus held a long staff in one hand and in the other, a small figure of victory, while Athena, firm and ready, gripped her spear. Their presence at the gateway of the harbor city reminded all who passed of divine authority and martial readiness, of wisdom and protection. Behind the portico, near the bustling markets close to the sea, another pair of statues stood, one of Zeus, the other of the Demos, the spirit of the people. These two were sculpted by Leochares, a renowned artist whose skill gave form to the ideals of divine rule and public voice, standing near the daily business of the townsfolk, reminding all that both divine order and civic life held their place in balance. Further inland, at Munichia, a town perched near the coast, a temple stood for Athena Skyras, while not far from it, another was built for Zeus. Though separated by distance, these sacred places remained connected through worship and tradition. In the smaller villages of Phlia and Myrrhinus, the divine was present too. Among the temples and altars found there, one held sacred spaces dedicated to Demeter and Isidora, the goddess who sent gifts from beneath the earth, and to Zeus Ctesios, the god associated with gain and household wealth. Here, the divine touched not only the skies, but the fields and homes of the people, guarding their food, prosperity, and blessings from within. High above the land, in the mountains of Attica, statues and altars were placed to honor the gods closer to the heavens. On Mount Hymettus stood a statue of Zeus Hymetios, watching over the land from his rocky throne. Not far from him were altars to Zeus Ombrios, the god of rain, who was called upon to bring water to the thirsty soil, and to Apollon Propsios, the one who sees ahead. On Mount Parnes, a bronze statue of Zeus Parnathios stood tall, near an altar dedicated to Zeus Semeleos, the sign-giving god. Here too, sacrifice was offered at another altar, where the god was called by different names, sometimes as Ombrios, bringer of rain, other times as Epemios, the averter of evil. Even the smaller mountain of Anchesmus held its own sacred image, a statue of Zeus Anchesmios, placed with devotion on its summit. In the village of Oropos, near the sanctuary of the hero Amphiaraos, an altar was divided among three divine beings, Heracles, Zeus, and Apollon the healer, each receiving offerings from those who came in search of health, strength, and divine guidance. Across the Cephisus river stood another ancient altar, this one dedicated to Zeus Mylikios, the gracious and gentle aspect of the god. It was here that the hero Theseus came, seeking purification after taking the lives of those who had wronged travelers on the roads, including Cenis, a man of cruel strength who had ties through blood to Theseus himself. The altar was tended by the descendants of Phytelos, keepers of the old ways, who performed the rites that washed away the stains of blood, granting renewal in the eyes of the gods. Farther south in the region of Megaris, the town of Megara held a grand precinct of Zeus known as the Olympieion. Within its bounds stood a temple that drew the eye and stirred reverence, but the statue within remained incomplete. The war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians had interrupted its making, halting the work that had begun with great care and ambition. Each year, the Athenians had launched attacks by sea and land, damaging the crops, destroying wealth, and driving families to despair. The public funds, once used for temples and art, were drained by the war, and so the statue remained unfinished. What had been completed was still impressive. The face of Zeus had been fashioned from ivory and gold, radiating power and calm, while the rest of his figure was shaped from clay and gypsum. The artist who began the work was said to be Theokosmos, a native of the city, assisted by the famous sculptor Phaedius, whose reputation stretched across the lands. Above the head of Zeus, carved carefully and placed with purpose, were figures of the Horai, the seasons, and the Moirai, the fates, all circling the king of the gods, symbols of order, time, and destiny. This temple, though incomplete, stood as a powerful reminder of the city's faith, of its struggle, and of its efforts to honor the one who ruled above. Through harbors and hills, villages and rivers, altars and statues rose across the land, each one a tribute to the many names and faces of Zeus, one could see that among all the gods, he alone obeyed the will of destiny, and it was he who divided the seasons, giving to each its rightful turn in time, ensuring balance and continuity in the cycle of the world. Behind the temple dedicated to him, in the sacred space, there still lay pieces of wood, unfinished and half-carved, intended long ago to be covered with ivory and gold. These were meant to complete the grand image of Zeus, a work envisioned by the sculptor Theokosmos, whose efforts had been interrupted before the vision could be fulfilled. Within the temple itself, resting in dedication, was a bronze ram taken from a galley. This ram, as the story went, had once belonged to a ship captured off the coast of Salamis during a naval conflict with the Athenians, and it had been brought here as a trophy and offering. Moving beyond the precinct of Zeus and climbing the ancient citadel, there came into view more sacred spaces, and among them was a peculiar and weathered temple of Zeus Konios, known as the Dusty, whose temple stood without a roof, exposed to the sky above. Nearby, in another temple close to one dedicated to the goddess of love, stood a bronze statue of Zeus crafted by the hand of Lysippos, and within the same space, statues of the Muses resided, embodying divine inspiration and art. The presence of Zeus here alongside them showed that his influence extended even into the realms of creativity and song. In the lands of Olympia, a statue was made in honor of the great athlete Diagoras, sculpted by Callicles, who was the son of the same Theokosmos, who had once begun the grand statue of Zeus at Megara, tying generations of artists to the god's lasting image. On the summit of Mount Gerania, the mountain that stood between the cities of Megara and Corinth, there was another temple, this one to Zeus, under the name Ephesios, the releaser. According to the old stories, a long drought once fell upon the lands of the Greeks, and the people, desperate for relief, turned to oracles. In obedience to the divine message spoken by the voice at Delphi, a man named Iacchos made a sacrifice to Zeus Panhellenios, the god of all the Greeks. The result was rain falling from the sky, ending the drought, and thus the god was honored with the title Ephesios, the one who releases suffering and brings relief to the land. In the city of Aegina, in the most prominent part of town, stood the shrine of Iacchos. The structure was a four-sided enclosure made of white marble, its walls gleaming in the sun, and at the entrance, carved in relief, were the figures of the envoys sent by the Greeks to seek Iacchos' help. As the Aeginetans told it, and as many other Greeks agreed, a terrible drought had afflicted their lands for a long time. No rain came either in the northern lands beyond the isthmus or in the southern region of the Peloponnesos. The dryness spread across the earth, and finally the people turned to the oracle at Delphi to learn why the skies withheld their gift and how they might bring the blessing of water once more. The answer that came back from the Pythian priestess was that Zeus must be honored, but he would not heed the prayers of the people unless they were spoken by Iacchos. And so messengers came from every city, gathering with hope and urgency, begging Iacchos to pray on their behalf. He did so, offering sacrifice and prayer to Zeus Panhellenios. And rain came at last, falling on the dry earth. In memory of this event, the Aeginetans made statues of those who came, preserving the moment in stone for generations to see. Inside the shrine, olive trees grew, ancient and untouched, having rooted themselves in that sacred place long ago. There was an altar there too, low and simple, rising just a little above the ground. The people whispered that this altar was also the tomb of Iacchos, but this was spoken as a holy secret, not revealed openly. Not far from the city, stood the mountain of Zeus Panhellenios, rising above the island of Aegina, where the god who had listened to the prayer and sent the rain was honored with reverence. There his name was carved into the rock, and the wind that blew across the peak seemed to carry the memory of that ancient act when one man's prayer opened the sky and turned the favor of the god upon the people once more. Through temples and statues, in shrines and on mountaintops, the legacy of the god remained, tied not only to power and rule, but also to mercy, to rain, and to the fate that even he, in his might, did not escape. His temples stood not only as monuments of worship, but as markers of stories, of acts that shaped the world, of moments when gods and mortals met through prayer, through sacrifice, and through the silent turning of the seasons. Mount Panhellenios, rising quietly on the island of Aegina, had little to draw the traveller's attention save one sacred place, a sanctuary dedicated to Zeus, the god of all the Greeks. This solitary structure stood alone on the mountain, and it was said to have been built by Iacchos, the first king of the island, in honor of the great god who had once answered his prayers with life-giving rain during a long and punishing drought. Though the mountain bore no other wonders to speak of, the sanctuary itself stood as a symbol of shared faith and divine favor, its simplicity matched only by the strength of its story. Southward, in the region of Corinthia, the grand city of Corinth revealed more faces of the god. In its bustling marketplace stood multiple images of Zeus, placed out in the open where the people moved and traded. One of the statues bore no surname, representing the god in his most essential and undefined form. Another was called Chthonios, the god of the lower world, and this aspect hinted at the underworld forces he governed. The third image was known as Hypsistos, the Most High, lifting the mind upward to the heavens, where the god's rule was seen as supreme and unquestioned. High above the theatre of Corinth, where crowds once gathered for song and drama, there was a sanctuary of Zeus with a title taken from the Latin language, Capitolium, which in Greek would mean Koryphaios, the one of the summit or head. Nearby, close to the gymnasium near the spring of Lerna, there were temples side by side, one for Zeus and one for Asclepius, the god of healing. The image of Zeus in this place was made of bronze, cast with skilled hands and standing silent near the waters that once brought refreshment and rest. As one moved away from the city, not toward the inland hills but along the road that led toward Sicyon, there stood the remains of a burned temple. Its blackened stones and ruined walls told no clear story, for wars had come often to Corinth, and flames had touched both homes and sacred spaces outside the city's protective walls. Some said this temple had once belonged to Apollon, and that it was Pyrrhus, the son of Achilleus, who had set it alight. But others claimed that it was built for Zeus Olympios, and that a sudden fire falling from some unknown source had consumed it in an instant. Whichever tale was true, the memory of the temple's destruction lived on, and the loss of the sanctuary was remembered as an omen. In later days, when Corinth prepared to join the Spartans in a campaign across Asia, the people hesitated. The sudden burning of the temple of Zeus Olympios had seemed a dark sign, and though they were eager, the Corinthians feared the meaning behind the flames and chose to stay behind, their hopes tempered by the whisper of divine warning. Northwest of Corinth, in the region of Sicyonia, the city of Sicyon offered its own reverence to Zeus. After passing the shrine of the hero Aratos, visitors came upon an altar to Poseidon Isthmios and another to Zeus Melikios, the gracious one. This altar stood in the shape of a pyramid, rising modestly yet with clear purpose. In the marketplace, under the open sky, there stood a bronze statue of Zeus, created by the famous sculptor Lysippus. The statue reflected both the strength and serenity of the god, standing calmly as people passed through the square, watching over commerce and gathering with an eternal stillness. Further to the south, in the region of Argolis, the city of Argos stood in a wide plain, its buildings spread across the land, while its citadel, called Larissa, rose upon a hill. This fortified place contained a temple to Zeus, placed there at a height above the city, where the god's gaze could reach far and wide. From this height, his presence felt nearer to the clouds and the changing sky. In the temple of Apollon Lykios within the city, wooden images of Zeus and Artemis had once been dedicated by Danaus, the legendary king of Argos. These humble offerings, carved from wood rather than stone or metal, reflected ancient traditions that valued the sacred power of even the simplest materials when placed before the gods. The legacy of the god reached deep into the land, winding through cities and plains, through burned ruins and mountain shrines, through marble sanctuaries and bronze forms. Whether called Panhellenios or Hypsistos, Melikios or Chthonios, he stood among his people, worshipped in many forms, each title carrying a fragment of his vast nature, each statue holding a piece of the sky. In the ancient city of Argos stood an image of Apollon, known there as the god who watched over the streets, and beside it was an altar dedicated to Zeus under the name Huetios, the bringer of rain. This sacred altar marked the place where warriors once gathered in solemn unity, those who had joined the cause of the exiled prince seeking to reclaim Thebes. Here they swore an oath before the god of rain, vowing that they would either capture the city or perish in the attempt, binding their fates to the skies above and to the justice they believed guided their swords. In another part of the city was a powerful image of Zeus Melikios, the gracious one, seated and carved from fine white marble by the sculptor Polykleitos. This statue had been created for a very particular reason, born from a time of civil unrest and bitter division, when long-standing hostilities between the people of Argos and their rivals in Laconia reached their peak. The Argives decided to train and maintain a force of 1,000 elite warriors to defend their city. The man chosen to lead this force was known for his cruelty and arrogance. His behavior toward ordinary citizens grew violent, and in one infamous incident, he took a young woman by force from her wedding procession. That night, while he slept, the girl took her revenge and blinded him. When morning came, her act was discovered, and she fled, seeking sanctuary among the people. When the 1,000 soldiers demanded her surrender and the people refused, violence erupted between the citizens and the elite warriors. The people emerged victorious, and in their fury, they left no survivors among their enemies. Afterwards, recognizing the burden of kinslaying and the need to purify themselves, they dedicated the image of Zeus Melikios, seeking his mercy and grace to wash away the stain of blood that had been drawn from their own brethren. Elsewhere in Argos stood a sanctuary of Zeus Nemeos, honoring his connection to the region of Nemea. In this sacred space was an upright bronze statue of the god, forged by the hand of the sculptor Lysippus, capturing the god's strength and stillness in gleaming metal, near the tomb of the legendary king Danaus, and beside the cenotaph raised for Argive warriors who had died either in the Trojan War or on their way back from it, there stood a sanctuary for Zeus under the name Sota, the Saviour, a place where prayers were offered to the one who protected and rescued mortals from danger and misfortune. in front of another sanctuary, this one belonging to the goddess of persuasion, stood an altar dedicated to Zeus Phyxios, who was invoked in matters of banishment and refuge, offering hope to those who had been cast out and a chance for return or peace. Not far away, opposite the grave of the Halii, a small bronze vessel held ancient images of three great deities, Artemis, Athena, and Zeus. One tradition, written down in the poems of Lycaeus, claimed that this figure of Zeus was known as Mechaneus, the god of cunning devices and clever strategies. It was here that the Argive warriors, before setting out for the long war against Troy, had sworn an oath to one another and to Zeus, pledging not to return until they had either taken the city or fallen in battle. Near the citadel of Argos, a racecourse stretched across the land, where games were held in honor of Zeus Nemeos and in celebration of the goddess Hera, echoing the ancient traditions of contests and festivals that brought the people together in strength and faith. At the summit of the citadel, the high place known as Larissa, there stood a temple dedicated to Zeus, under the title Larissaios, the god of Larissa. This temple had no roof, and its walls opened upward to the sky, leaving the space exposed to the winds and the changing light. Though the structure was simple, its presence on the peak of the city's highest point gave it a quiet authority, as though the god himself watched over Argos from above, his temple merging with the sky. The wooden construction of this temple reminded those who visited of older times, when the materials of worship were drawn directly from the earth, shaped by hand and offered in reverence. Through all these sanctuaries, altars, and statues, the god appeared in many forms, gracious, of the rain, of refuge, of strategy, of salvation, of the mountain, of Nemea, each title capturing a different part of his power, each place holding a memory of promise, of oath, of war, or of forgiveness. The people of Argos, in their victories and in their suffering, had turned again and again to the god in his many names, seeking strength when they marched to war, mercy when they fell to anger, protection when they were lost, and wisdom when their city stood divided. These sacred places, scattered across the city and nestled into its hills, bore the marks of those stories, and in every statue and altar, the silent presence of the god remained. The image once stood proudly on its pedestal, but now it no longer remained in its place, its absence leaving only the memory of what had been. Nearby was a temple of Athena, a place worth seeing, filled with votive offerings placed by those who had come in reverence. Among these sacred objects was a remarkable wooden image of Zeus, unlike any other, for it had not two but 3 eyes, 2 set in the usual place, and a third fixed in the center of the forehead. This peculiar feature gave the statue a unique and powerful presence, and the people told a story that explained why it was there. They said that this image of Zeus was once held as a sacred protector by Priamos, the king of Troy and son of Laomedon. The statue had been set in an open courtyard within the palace, where it stood under the sky. When the city of Troy fell to the Greeks and destruction consumed the once great halls, Priamos fled to this very altar, seeking sanctuary and protection. Though his fate was tragic, the image survived the fall of the city, when the spoils of Troy were divided among the victors. This statue was taken by Sthenelus, the son of Capaneus, and brought to its current resting place, dedicated here as a relic of war and devotion. The mystery of its 3 eyes stirred the minds of many, and some offered an explanation rooted in the nature of the god himself. Zeus, they said, was king of the heavens, a belief shared by all. Yet he was also known under the earth, For Homer himself had spoken of Zeus Chthonios, who ruled below alongside the dread Persephone. And in the vast sea, the waves were said to rise and fall under the command of another force, also called Zeus, as spoken by the poet Aeschylus. And so, the craftsman who had carved the statue must have given it 3 eyes to show that Zeus ruled not only the sky, but also the earth and the sea, the 3 parts of the world, the 3 great regions of existence, each under the watchful gaze of the same divine power. To the south, in the lands of Argolis, lay the ancient region of Nemea, nestled between the cities of Cleone and Phlios. There, in the sacred precinct, the people of Argos celebrated the Nemean Games, a festival of contest and remembrance held in honor of Zeus. The myth of the Nemean lion, the fearsome beast once slain by a hero, was set in these very lands, giving the place both historical and legendary weight. Among the solemn sites in Nemea was a temple of Zeus Nemeos, once grand and revered, but now found with its roof collapsed and no image of the god remaining inside. Around the ruins, a grove of cypress trees stood in silence, and among them lay the place where a small child named Opheltes was once left upon the grass by his nurse. It was here that he met his end at the coils of a draken, a moment of sorrow that cast a shadow over the grove. The people of Argos came to Nemea, not only for games, but to perform burnt offerings to Zeus, keeping the rites alive even as the temple aged and crumbled. They appointed a priest to tend to the god's rites, and offered prizes for a race in full armor during the winter celebration of the festival. Nearby, the grave of Opheltes could be seen, marked by a fence of stones that surrounded the resting place. Within that sacred space, altars were raised, and offerings made in memory of the child. There also stood a mound of earth, the tomb of his father Lycurgus, who carried his own burden of sorrow and legend. The Thebans gave offerings in honor of Dionysos and Apollo Ismenios in their usual way, following the customs that had long been handed down among them, while the people of Argos gave their own sacrifices to Hera Argeia and Zeus Nemeos, gods they held close through tradition and regional devotion. At the same time, the people of Messenia brought their offerings to Zeus Ithamatos, whose name was tied to the sacred heights of Ithome, and to the Dioscoroi, the twin brothers who stood as protectors in war and travelers' aid. Above the quiet area of Lesser in Argolis rose Mount Arachnios, its name recalling the webs of spiders, but its summit dedicated not to insects or creatures, but to gods. On this mountain, the people had built altars for Zeus and Hera, and it was here that they climbed, when the skies had stayed too long without rain. They came bearing sacrifices and prayers, asking the 2 great deities to send water from the heavens, believing the high place would carry their voices better into the sky. In the town of Troizenos, also in Argolis, there stood a sanctuary of Zeus known by the name Soter, the Saviour. And this sacred place was said to have been built by a ruler named Aetios, a son of Anthus, during the time he held power over the land. His dedication marked a moment of protection, where the god's help had once been sought or received, and the memory of that protection was carved into stone and ritual. Following the road that led from Troizenos to Hermione, the traveller would pass through the mountains and eventually come to a great rock, once known as the altar of Zeus Tithenios, the Strong. In time, this place came to be known by another name, the Rock of Theseus, for it was under this rock that the young hero had discovered the sword and boots left for him by his father, marking the start of his journey and changing the name of the sacred place forever in the memory of those who told the tale. The story echoed again along another road from Troizenos to Hermione, which passed the same rock, now called by the name of the hero, but which still held the older identity of a place once consecrated to Zeus under his strong and mighty title. High in the region stood Mount Xakegios, a mountain once called Thornex, but renamed because of an old legend tied to transformation. It was said that here, on this very mountain, Zeus had once turned himself into a cuckoo bird, and though time passed and the story grew distant, the name endured. Even now, sanctuaries still remain at the tops of the mountains. On Kikios stood a place sacred to Zeus, and on the neighboring mountain of Bron, one to Hera, their presence overlooking the lands below. Zeus, the Olympian king of the gods, ruled over the sky, the winds, and the rain, and guided fate, law, justice, and all proper conduct. His name stretched across all lands, but in the western Peloponnese, his worship held special weight. Here stood some of his greatest sanctuaries, including the famous one at Olympia, where the Olympic Games were held, and the ancient mountain shrine of Lycaon in Arcadia. His presence was both distant and close, celestial and grounded, reigning from above but worshipped in the earth and stone of sacred places. In Lacedaemonia, the region better known as Sparta, his cult took on local forms shaped by the discipline and order of the Spartan people. In their central marketplace, the Spartans had raised a sanctuary not only for Gaia, the earth, but also for Zeus Agoraios, who oversaw the business and judgment that unfolded in the heart of the city. Beside him was Athena under the same name, sharing the space and guardianship of the public square. Another statue honored Zeus Xenios, who protected the laws of hospitality, ensuring strangers were received with proper respect and kindness, a virtue held dear even by the harshest of cities. Athena stood again at his side in this, also as Xenia, reflecting the shared guardianship they held over guests and the sacred bond of offering shelter and peace. Elsewhere in the city stood the sanctuary of Zeus Tropaios, known as the one who turns the tide of battle, bringing flight and retreat to enemies. This particular sanctuary had been built by the Dorians after they defeated the people of Amyclae and the Achaeans who once lived in the region. Their victory had marked a turning point, and in gratitude, they dedicated this place to Zeus, recognizing his hand in turning the battle in their favor. The sanctuary became a lasting sign of divine support in war, a place where prayers and thanks were offered for triumphs already won and victories yet to come. Through towns and highlands, marketplaces and mountain paths, in stories of war and rain, justice and fate, the image of the god appeared again and again, not as one fixed shape, but as many forms, each name reflecting one part of his great and unseen power. His altars marked places where oaths were sworn, where rains were begged for, where victories were remembered, and where safety was praised. Whether called Soter, Xenios, Nemeos, Sthenios, or Tropaios, the god stood as protector and judge, and across these lands the stones and altars, the groves and mountains bore his presence, watching silently over those who lived, prayed, and remembered. A spring flowed in the area, known by the name Adrasteia. The reason for this name was uncertain, though some believed it was because the spring had once been discovered by Adrastos. Rising above Nemea was Mount Apessus, a place where the air was thinner and the winds more wild. It was on this mountain that Perseus, the legendary slayer of monsters, was said to have made his first sacrifice to Zeus under the title Apesanthios. This act, long remembered, marked the mountain as a sacred place, and Zeus, worshipped there under that name, held a high and solemn presence over the land. So, from the temple with the three-eyed image to the silent groves of Nemea, from the sacred mountain top to the ruined halls where statues once stood, the god remained present in many forms, protector of cities, receiver of oaths, ruler of sky, sea, and underworld, worshipped in open fields and stone temples alike. Each place, each altar, each name told a part of the story, and through them all, the same power watched the world, unseen yet always felt, in wood, in bronze, in broken walls and flowing springs. The canopy was a circular building in the city of Sparta, and within its curved structure stood the images of Zeus and Aphrodite, both worshipped under the title Olympioi. This structure was said to have been established by Epimenides, though the story the Spartans told of him was not the same as that told by the Argives. The people of Sparta strongly denied the claim that they had ever engaged in conflict with the people of Knossos, suggesting that the roots of this monument lay not in warfare, but in something more mysterious or ceremonial. Not far from this place stood another sacred area, shaped by square porticos, a site that had once served the people as a marketplace where common goods were sold. Beside this old market was an altar dedicated to Zeus Ambulios, the god of wise counsel, and to Athena, who bore the same title, Ambulia. Alongside them stood the Dioscuri, who were also honored with the same name, for their wisdom and guidance in both peace and war. These gods, placed together in one space, reflected a deep respect for strategic thinking and careful planning among the Spartans. Elsewhere in the city stood a sanctuary of the Zeus Euenamos, the god of fair winds. In a city known for its strength on land, this god represented the rare but cherished hope for favorable journeys and smooth weather. Perhaps in connection with trade or movement beyond the familiar mountains, a separate sanctuary was also devoted to Zeus Olympios, showing again the city's reverence for the highest of gods. As one walked toward the south portico of the Spartan citadel, the temple of Zeus Cosmetes came into view. He was honored as the orderer, the one who brought harmony and structure to the city and its laws, a fitting presence in a society so focused on discipline and order. Not far from the temple of Athena, known as the Lady of the Bronze House, there stood an ancient bronze image of Zeus Hepatus, meaning the Most High. This statue was known as the oldest bronze representation of the god in the city. It had not been cast as a single piece, but created by hammering each limb separately, each part carefully shaped and then joined together using nails to hold the figure in place. The name of the artist was said to be Clearchus of Rhegium, who was believed by some to have been taught by the legendary sculptors Dipuenos and Scylis, and by others to have been a student of the mythical Daedalus himself. This statue stood not only as a symbol of divine power, but also as a reflection of the ancient craftsmanship that brought the gods into visible form. One of the darker stories tied to Zeus in Sparta came from the history of a man named Pausanias. After the murder of a girl named Cleonike, he tried in vain to cleanse himself of the guilt. He went through many rituals of purification, and even became a suppliant of Zeus Phyxios, the god who receives those who flee in search of mercy. He sought out wizards in the distant city of Phigalia in Arcadia, trying to lift the burden that clung to him. But in the end, he was made to pay the price for his actions. To bring peace between the people and the divine, the Spartans, following an oracle's command from Delphi, had bronze images crafted in honor of the diamond epidotes, known as the Bountiful One. They believed it was this spirit who helped turn aside the anger of Zeus Hykesios, the god who protects suppliants and those who come seeking shelter after wrongdoing. During another time, when the prophet Apollonius of Tyana visited the city, the people of Sparta gathered around him and welcomed him to share in the sacred hospitality of their shrine dedicated to Zeus. This act showed the continued strength of their traditions and the enduring presence of the god in their public and sacred life. Further out in the land of Lacedaemonia, in a district known as Scotitas, which means dark, the name was not given because of thick forests or shadowed woods, but because of the god who was worshipped there. Zeus Scotitas, named after the darkness, had a sanctuary placed on the left side of the road, about 10 stades away from the main path. The mystery of this title suggested a deeper, perhaps older reverence for Zeus in his more hidden or shadowed form. Travelling further to the town of Amyclae, one would approach the river Eurotas, and just before crossing it, the journey through these sacred places continued. Though the rest of the description fades, what remains is the enduring image of a land filled with temples, statues, and altars, all pointing toward one god in many forms. In Sparta and its surrounding lands, Zeus was worshipped as Olympus, Ambulios, Euenemos, Cosmetes, Hippatos, Phyxios, Hicasios, Scotitas, and more, each name capturing a part of his power and purpose, each shrine preserving a piece of his presence. In public squares, high citadels, shadowed roads, and sacred guest halls, the people built their faith in stone and bronze, shaping their lives around the order, counsel, mercy, justice, and might of the god who watched over them from sky and sanctuary alike. A little above the bank, standing quiet and somewhat removed from the flowing water, there was a sanctuary dedicated to Zeus under the title Plausios, the god of wealth. This sacred space, though modest, held great significance, for wealth was considered not just material abundance, but the blessing of fullness, of crops, of herds, of peace, and of divine favor that allowed communities to thrive. Farther along, in the region of Phelia, a village in Lacedaemonia, the road curved to the right and led onward to the towering heights of Mount Taygetos. Before the climb began, down on the plain below, there stood a sacred precinct devoted to Zeus Messapus. The people believed that the god bore this name after a man who had served him faithfully as priest, leaving behind both a name and a place touched by divine association. The fields around this precinct whispered of old rites and prayers, offered beneath the mountain's shadow. Further south, before one reached the village of Crocae, another image of Zeus could be found, carved in marble and standing at the edge of the path. This was Zeus Crocatos, honored by name in this village, his image enduring in stone even as time moved forward. Just beyond, about 3 stades from the village of Kythion, another unusual monument could be found, an unwrought stone left in its natural form. This stone had no carved features, no inscription, and yet it was deeply sacred. Legend said that when Orestes, tormented by madness, came to this place and sat upon the stone, the madness left him. The stone, because of this story, came to be known in the Dorian tongue as Zeus Capotes, for it was here the god, in unseen form, lifted away the torment that plagued a broken soul. The power of healing, unshaped by hand, was held in that plain and untouched stone. At the coastal village of Epidaurus Limera, facing the sea, there stood a temple of Zeus bearing the title Soter, the Saviour. This temple stood just before the harbour, watching over the ships that came and went, protecting those who sailed and those who waited. It was here that sailors prayed before departure, or gave thanks upon their return. believing that the god's presence shielded them from the winds and the waves. Across the waters of the river Skyras, not far from its banks, there was yet another altar to Zeus. The river's flow passed gently beside it, the sound of water joining the silent offerings laid down by those who passed that way. On the coast of Leuctra, an event had taken place that remained fresh even in recent memory. A wind-blown fire had swept through a wooded area, consuming many trees and leaving behind a scorched and bare landscape. But when the fire cleared, something hidden was revealed. A statue of Zeus Ithamatus, the god tied to Mount Ithome. The Messenians, upon discovering this, claimed it as evidence that the land had once belonged to them, for Zeus Ithamatus was deeply connected to their region. Yet there was another possibility, that the people of Lacedaemon, who may have once dwelled in Leuctra, had also worshipped Zeus under this name. The statue, revealed by fire, stirred memories of older boundaries and forgotten worship. Farther into Messenia, on the road that turned left from the springs, after about 40 stades of travel, lay the city of the Messenians beneath the shelter of Mount Ithome. Within the heart of the city, in the center of the marketplace, there stood a statue of Zeus Soter, the savior. His presence there offered not only protection, but also a reminder of the divine guidance believed to rest over their civic life and gatherings. Rising high above the city was the summit of Ithome itself, the acropolis of the region. The path to the top passed a spring called Clepsydra, and though it was known that many places claimed to be the birthplace of Zeus, each telling stories of his upbringing among them, the Messenians held their own version of this tale. They believed the god had been raised in their land by two nurturing nymphs, Ithome and Neda. The river was named after Neda, and the mountain after Ithome, both caretakers of the god when he was hidden away by the Curetes, who had stolen him in secret to save him from a looming threat. It was here, in these wild and ancient places, that the nymphs had bathed him and kept him safe. These stories, sanctuaries, statues, altars, and names stretched across the villages and plains of Lacedaemonia and Messenia, tying each location to the god through memory and reverence, whether he was called Plusios, Messapius, Krokeatos, Capotes, Soter, or Ithamatus. Zeus was honored in each form, each name a reflection of his role in the lives of those who worshipped him. The god of wealth, of counsel, of wind, of strength, of healing, of salvation. Each title marked a relationship between people and power, between divine protection and human need. The marble stood where roads crossed. The unwrought stone rested where pain once ended. The fire revealed what time had hidden, and in every place the god's presence endured, in form and name, carried forward by memory and faith. His father, and it is said that it has its name from the theft by the Curetes, for it was they who took the infant god and carried him to safety. Each day, without fail, water was brought from the spring to the sanctuary of Zeus Ithamatos, located upon the height of Mount Ithome, the god's sacred seat. The statue that stood in this sanctuary was the work of the sculptor Ageladas, a figure known for his skill and devotion, and the image had originally been made for the Messenians who had settled in Naupactos during their time of exile. The priest of the sanctuary was not a permanent official, but one who was chosen each year, and the responsibility passed from one to another, with the image itself being kept in the priest's home during his time of service. Every year, the people of Messenia held a festival in honor of Zeus, called the Ithomia, a gathering that brought the people together in celebration and reverence. In earlier times, the Ithomaya had included a musical contest, something remembered not only through tradition, but also preserved in poetry. The poet Umelos, in his hymn written for the island of Delos, had written that the muse was dear to Zeus Ithamatos, describing her as one whose lute was pure and whose sandals were unburdened, free in her step. These words suggested clearly that music had once been a sacred part of the celebration, and that the sound of strings and voice had filled the mountain air in the god's honor. The devotion to Zeus Ithamatos was not limited to festivals alone, but continued through sacrifices and dedications, especially in times of need. When the Thebans offered sacrifices to Dionysus and Apollo Ismenios in their own way, and the people of Argos gave honor to Hera Argaia and Zeus Nemeos, it was the Messenians who turned to Zeus Ithamatos and to the twin gods, the Dioskoroi, for guidance and support. Among the Messenians, this worship of Zeus had deep roots, though it was not always practiced without interruption. In earlier times, after the land had been taken by the Dorians, the sanctuary on Ethame, originally consecrated by Polycon and Messene, had fallen into neglect, receiving no honor from the new rulers. It was only when Glaucus became king that the worship was restored. He was known for his piety, and it was he who re-established the sacred rites and brought life back to the summit of Ethme, ensuring the god received his due reverence once more. Later, during the long and bitter war between Messenia and Sparta, in the 20th year of the conflict, the Messenians sent envoys to Delphi to ask the oracle once again about their chances of victory. The response from the Pythia came in clear but poetic words, saying that glory in war and the land of Messenia would belong to those who first set up 100 tripods around the altar of Zeus Ithamatos. For this was what Zeus himself had ordained. The oracle added that deceit had brought this conflict into being, and that punishment followed it in turn, warning that the gods could not be tricked, and that the course of fate would not be altered. The Messenians, believing this to be a sign that the favor of the gods was on their side, since they possessed the sanctuary within their city and thus could complete the dedication first, set to work making tripods, though they could only fashion them from wood, as they had no bronze or precious materials to spare. But news of the oracle did not remain with them alone. One of the Delphians, breaking trust, reported the prophecy to the Spartans. And although the Spartan leadership had no clear plan, there was a man named Oibalos, of little standing and not known widely even among his own people, who came up with a clever solution. He crafted 100 tripods from clay, doing what he could with limited means, and packed them into a bag that also held hunting nets, disguising himself as a man out for game. Because he was little known, even among his fellow Spartans, he could pass more easily among the enemy without raising suspicion. He joined with some local men who were traveling toward Itham and entered the town unnoticed, blending into the group. As night fell, he went to the sanctuary and placed the clay tripods in dedication to Zeus, fulfilling the conditions of the oracle. Then, having completed his task, he slipped away and returned to Sparta, where he told of his deed. The act was bold and cunning, and though the tripods were simple and made of clay, they fulfilled the oracle's command. This moment, remembered and retold, became a symbol of how the contest for divine favor was as much a battle of wit as of war, and how even a single unknown man could shift the course of a people's hopes. The Messenians, unaware of the Spartan trick until it was too late, continued their own dedication, believing they had gained the blessing of the gods. But the secret tripods stood as silent witnesses to the unseen hand that had turned fate against them. And in the years that followed, though the sanctuary remained, and though the priest still carried water from the spring and kept the statue in his house, the memory of that night lingered, when one man's deception fulfilled a prophecy, and 100 clay tripods changed the shape of hope. In the high place of Ithom, where music once echoed and the muse danced lightly before the god, where nymphs were said to have bathed the child hidden from danger, and where kings restored forgotten rights, the presence of Zeus Ithamatos endured, silent but watching, his altar surrounded by memory, and his name carried on by those who still believed. The Lacedaemonians had made their move, and when the Messenians saw the signs of their presence, fear spread quickly among them, for they knew without doubt that these actions came from their old enemies. Even so, Aristodemos, the leader of the Messenians, stood before his people and offered words meant to strengthen their hearts. He said what the moment required, trying to give courage to those already filled with dread. Around the altar of Zeus Ithamatos, the tripods that had been crafted from wood were now set in place, forming a circle of hope and resistance. But fate, already turning against them, allowed no illusions to remain. The god revealed what was to come through a series of signs. First, the statue of Artemis, made entirely of bronze and armed for battle, dropped its shield. It fell with a sound that echoed like a warning. Then, as Aristodemos began the sacred act of sacrifice to Zeus Ithamatos, the rams that were meant to be offered ran forward by themselves. Without being led or forced, they charged toward the altar, struck it with their horns, and died on the spot, felled by the sheer force of their own impact. Then came a third sign. The dogs, which had always been near and loyal, began to gather together each night and howl in unison, their cries filling the dark with dread. Eventually, as if drawn by some unseen force, they fled together from the Messenian camp and ran to the enemy. These were not ordinary happenings. Aristodemos understood the meaning. The gods had spoken, and they had not spoken in favor of Messenia. With no hope left for his homeland and no strength to endure what lay ahead, he went to the tomb of his child, and there, in grief and despair, he ended his own life. Still, the Messenians held on to something secret, a hidden object whose power tied directly to the survival of their land. This thing, known only to a few, carried with it the weight of prophecy. If it were ever lost or destroyed, Messenia would fall forever. But if it were kept safe, the words of the oracle, spoken long ago by Lycos, the son of Pandion, said that in time the Messenians would one day regain their homeland. Aristomenes, a leader who knew the full meaning of these oracles, took it into his own hands. As night approached, he carried the object in silence to the most desolate part of Mount Ithome. There, alone among the shadows of the mountain, he dug into the earth and buried it. With hands in the soil and a heart full of plea, he called upon Zeus, the protector of Ithome, and upon the gods who had stood with the Messenians through all their trials. He asked them to guard what had been placed in their care and to keep it from falling into the hands of their enemies. He begged that the only hope of return not be handed over to those who had taken so much already. Later, as the war reached its long and bitter turning point, the Messenians found themselves trapped in Ithome once more. The strength of the place gave them shelter, and the might of its heights made any assault a costly venture. The Athenians, understanding how deeply the Lacedaemonians hated them, made an alliance with the Argives and extended their hand to the desperate Messenians. They gave them Naupactos, a new place of refuge, when it was finally agreed that the defenders of Ithome could leave under a truce. This retreat was not a defeat of spirit, but a retreat of survival, made possible not just by stone walls and cliffs, but by the voice of the gods. The Pythia, the oracle of Delphi, had spoken clearly to the Lacedaemonians. She warned them that if they dared commit a crime against the suppliants of Zeus Ithamatos, those who had placed their hope and lives in the hands of the god, they would be punished. This divine warning bound them, and so the truce was granted. The Messenians left Ithome with dignity, not as prisoners, but as people protected by divine will. Far from the mountaintop, in the village of Corone, another image of Zeus stood, this one cast in bronze and placed in the marketplace. It was Zeus Soter, the saviour, and his presence reminded the people that even in difficult times, even in small towns far from great battles, the god remained with them, watching over trade and speech, war and peace alike. In the region of Elis, worship of Zeus continued through both tradition and judgment. Within the square-shaped gymnasium in the main city, a statue of Zeus had been placed, not simply as a mark of honor, but created from the fines collected from those who had broken the rules. Sosandros of Smyrna and Polyktor of Elis had each been found at fault and fined, and their penalties were used to craft this image of the god. Justice, law, and divine power were bound together, the punishment of men transformed into a tribute to the divine. Near the pillars of the hippodrome, where races once stirred dust into the air and the sound of hooves echoed across the crowds, the people had raised altars to Zeus as well. These altars stood as reminders that even in places of sport and contest, the favor of the god was sought and his blessing welcomed. From the heights of Ithome to the plains of Elis, from hidden relics buried in the soil to bronze statues standing tall in open squares, the presence of Zeus stretched wide across the land. In times of war and signs of doom, in rituals of music and festivals of joy, in acts of desperation and gestures of trust, the people turned again and again to the god who watched over them from above. Whether as Ithamatos Soter or simply Zeus, his name carried weight, his altars held memory, and his stories shaped the fate of cities, warriors, and kings. Made to Zeus were offerings set upon altars in the open marketplace, not many in number, for they were simple in form and built in such a way that they could be taken apart easily, set up and removed without great effort. These altars, though lacking grandeur, carried deep meaning, their impermanence reflecting the readiness of the people to assemble worship quickly, wherever the god might be honored. Yet even simplicity did not shield the sacred from violence, for in the city of Elis, a man named Aristodemos had risen to power as a despot. His rule did not last without resistance, and a man named Chilon, with others, led a rising against him. When Aristodemos, in his final desperation, fled to the altar of Zeus Soter, hoping for the god's protection, it was in that very sanctuary that Chilon found him. The sanctuary, meant to offer refuge and mercy, instead became the site of his death, for Chilon, unmoved, struck him down with his own hand. The altar, which should have stood as a shield of the helpless, bore witness to the fall of a man who had lost all support, political and divine. In the nearby village of Lepreus, the people told of a temple that once stood within their city, a temple dedicated to Zeus under the title Lukaios, the god of the white poplar. Though the temple no longer stood, the memory of it endured, tied to the name and form of the god, as he was once honored there. But the greatest of all sanctuaries dedicated to Zeus was at Olympia, a place unlike any other, where worship and athletic strength were bound together in the Olympic Games. Held every 4 years, The festival honored the god with contests of the body and offerings of the spirit. The games became so central to Greek life that, as one Roman writer observed, they had taken possession of the very calendar of Greece. 13 miles inland from Pylos, this sacred space rose up in greatness and drew people from every corner of the land. It was here that Zeus was honored in his most famous form, not just in prayer, but in sweat, endurance, and glory, as the strongest and fastest competed beneath his gaze. To the north, in the region of Achaea, the worship of Zeus continued in towns like Patrai. In the heart of the city's marketplace, there was a temple to Zeus Olympios. Inside, the image of the god sat upon a throne, powerful and still, and beside him stood Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, as if standing in counsel and companionship. Their presence together in the temple showed the unity of might and thought, of action guided by reason. In another town, Aegean, Zeus was also honored, this time under the name Soter, the Savior. His precinct stood in the market, and at the left as one entered were 2 bronze images of him, one bearing a beard and one not. The beardless one seemed older, its style more ancient, and perhaps it held a deeper echo of an earlier time. Directly in front of the entrance to this sacred precinct was another building, within which stood 4 more bronze images: Poseidon, Heracles, Zeus, and Athena. These were known as the gods from Argos, not because they came from the city, but because they had been made there. The people of Aegean said that the Argives had entrusted the statues to them, placing them in their care with the instruction to make daily sacrifices. But rather than bear the cost, the people of Aegean devised a plan. They sacrificed many animals, yes, but then they held great feasts, consuming the meat themselves. In this way, they appeared obedient, yet spared their own resources. When the Argives asked for the statues back, the people of Aegean demanded repayment for the cost of all the animals they had offered in sacrifice. Unable to pay the demanded sum, the Argives left the images behind, and so the gods remained in Aegean. By the sea, still within the same town, there was another sanctuary, this one dedicated to Zeus under the name Homogeirios, meaning the assembler. Alongside him stood images of Aphrodite and Athena, a triad of divine figures tied to different realms of life. The title Homogeirios suggested that Zeus here was honored not just as king of the sky, but as the god who brought people together. He assembled crowds, gatherings, and unity, making him central not only to worship but to the civic life of the people. In the waves nearby, the sea whispered beneath the sky that held his power, and the land bore statues of gods who watched over the people with memory, judgment, and grace. From humble altars made for ease to great sanctuaries guarded by tradition and fear, the presence of Zeus in the southern lands of Greece was found everywhere, in markets, on thrones, beside harbours, within sanctuaries built of bronze and stone, and even in tales of deception and clever bargains. His titles were many: Soter, Olympus, Lukaios, Homogeirios, each name tied to a story, a people, a place. Some remembered him for safety, others for assembly, others still for the strength he gave or the justice he upheld. Some prayed to him at altars that could be packed away in haste. Some gave him temples that reached the clouds. Others sought his protection and found only fate. But in each of these places, through each of these names, he remained the same great God, watching, waiting, receiving, and remembering. Temple had a name written on it. Time had since worn it away, but the people knew to whom it belonged, and so they honored it as the temple of the good god. They said this god was Zeus in a friendly and gracious form, one who protected the city and brought good fortune to its people. As one walked through the gate to the marsh in Megalopolis and followed the river Helicon toward Mount Mainalos, the temple stood humbly on the left side of the road, not grand or adorned with riches, but set in quiet strength beside flowing waters, a place of worship that blended with the land and carried prayers of hope and well-being. Within the city, in the marketplace of Megalopolis, the river Helicon divided the town, and on the north side, where the riverbank sloped gently, the people had built an enclosure of stones. Here stood a sanctuary of Zeus Lycaios, the wolf Zeus, and though there was no way to enter the space, one could see through to the altars within, the 2 stone tables, the twin eagles, and an image of Pan. This Zeus was ancient, older than most, bound to the wildness of the mountains and the shadows of early times, and his sanctuary reflected that mystery, sealed and watchful. Not far from this sacred place, on the eastern side of a portico built in honor of Aristandros, there rose another sanctuary, dedicated to Zeus under the title of Soter, the Savior. This one was surrounded by tall pillars, elegant and strong, and within it sat Zeus on a throne. On his right stood an image representing the city of Megalopolis itself, proud and carved in noble lines, and on his left was Artemis, also titled Sotera, the Savior, carved from Pentelic marble by 2 artists from Athens, Kephisodotos and Xenophon. Together, the 3 figures, Zeus, the city, and the goddess, stood in quiet balance, a symbol of protection and unity. Elsewhere in Megalopolis, within the sacred ground of Demeter, there was yet another temple of Zeus, this one honoring him as Philius, the friendly one. The image within was crafted by Polykleitos of Argos, one of the greatest sculptors of his time. The statue bore likeness to Dionysos, wearing buskins on its feet and holding a beaker in one hand and a thyrsus in the other. But resting on the thyrsus was an eagle, a sign that this was not Dionysus at all, but Zeus in a form that welcomed and embraced, the god of friendship and shared drink, reminding the people that even the great ruler of the sky could appear in the gentlest ways. Moving from Arcadia to Achaea to the city of Aegion, there was another sacred place of Zeus, standing not alone but with others in a group of bronze images, one of Zeus as a boy, another of Heracles as a beardless youth. Both were crafted by the hand of Ageladas of Argos. In older times, the role of priest for the boy god Zeus was given to the child deemed most beautiful, and as soon as his beard began to grow, the title would pass to the next most beautiful boy. This ritual showed a link between youth, grace, and divine favor, for the god was honored through those who embodied beauty and innocence. Each priest, once chosen, kept the statue in his own home for the year, serving the god with care. In that same city of Aegion stood another sacred memory, an assembly place where, long ago, the great Agamemnon had gathered the finest warriors of Greece to plan the war against Troy. It was here, in this very place, that the leaders consulted on how to strike the empire of Priam. This moment in history became part of the city's identity, and even in later times, the Achaean assembly still met in Aegion, much like the famous Amphictyonic councils gathered in Thermopylae and Delphi. Farther inland, in the town of Aegara, another image of Zeus was found. It was a sitting figure made of Pentelic marble, the work of Euclides of Athens. The sanctuary was known for its peaceful setting and the quality of its craftsmanship, a testament to the enduring care with which people honored the god across all regions. In every city, from the coastal shrines of Achaea to the mountain sanctuaries of Arcadia, from the wide plains of Elis to the crowded marketplaces of Megalopolis. Zeus appeared in many forms, with many titles, each tied to the land, to the people, to the stories that had taken root there. He was the wolf, the saviour, the friendly one, the boy god, the assembler of warriors, the king who welcomed beauty, the good god beside the marsh road. Some of his temples were grand, with pillars and marble and thrones. Others were quiet, enclosed, and hidden. Some images were guarded in marketplaces, others in private homes. Some were new, shining with art, and others old, with time-worn altars built of stone. But all of them were made to carry the same purpose, to offer a place where people could reach toward the sky, with prayer, with sacrifice, with memory, and ask for guidance, protection, strength, and peace from the one ruled over them all. That flows by the same name took its origin, and from Hakno, a spring on the mountain, that is still revered by those who live in the region. The water of this spring was said to be cold and clear, and many believed it had sacred powers, flowing directly from the place where the child god once opened his eyes to the world. On the slopes of Mount Lycaon, a place called Crataea still held the memory of the god's early life. The people of Arcadia, with deep conviction, claimed that their mountain was the true site where the greatest of the gods was raised, cared for by these nurturing nymphs, and not on the distant island others often spoke of. They believed their version with unshakable pride, and their stories ran deep in the land, through city, river, and spring, binding together the divine and the earthly in one great lineage. Higher up, near the peak of the mountain, was the sacred grove of Zeus Lycaos, and this grove was unlike any other. The sanctuary was ancient, and within it none were allowed to cast a shadow. No person, once they had stepped inside, could survive if they did not quickly turn back and leave. It was believed that even the birds avoided flying over it. Such was the fear and awe surrounding the altar at the heart of the grove, the same place where dark stories had long taken root. Among those stories, one stood above all, the tale of Lycaon, the early ruler of the land, who in a moment of unholy arrogance brought a child as a sacrifice to the god. He placed it on the altar and poured its blood in a rite that horrified even the heavens. The legend said that no sooner had the sacrifice been made than he himself was turned into a wolf. This story passed down through the generations, never fading. It was not dismissed as mere myth, for the people believed it carried a warning. It told of a time when mortals still sat at the same tables as gods, when the divine and human were not yet fully separated, and when piety and wickedness each brought swift and visible rewards or punishments. And so, the name Zeus Lycaos held both reverence and fear, for it was tied not only to the god's power, but to the consequence of impiety. Later philosophers and travellers, such as those from distant cities, had heard the tales. Some repeated them with caution, others with wonder. One account told of a mysterious ritual, one so secret that few dared speak of it openly. During this rite, it was said that in the mixing of offerings, a single morsel of human flesh would be added. If a man unknowingly consumed that piece, he would be transformed into a wolf, living as a beast for 9 years. And if during those 9 years he never tasted human flesh again, he would return to his human form. This belief lingered among the people, not as a tale for children, but as a hidden truth bound to the mountain and its god. It was not a story of cruelty for amusement, but one that underscored the weight of divine justice and the purity demanded at Zeus's altar. Even though the shrine of Zeus Lycaos was no longer honored in grand festivals as it once had been, it remained a sacred spot. Pilgrims still came to stand at its edge, to peer through the trees and glimpse the old altar. The mountain itself, sometimes called Olympus by the locals, sometimes Hieros, or the sacred peak, loomed over the region, marking its presence as the highest place in Arcadia. Those who climbed its slopes could see for miles across the land, and they carried with them the feeling that they were walking into something older than memory, where gods had once walked among the living. Stories like that of Lycaon were not seen as strange or unbelievable by the people of the region. They understood that in ancient times the world had been different. Their ancestors had spoken directly with the gods, and the gods had answered with signs and wonders. The Lycaea Games, founded by Lycaon, were believed to be one of the oldest religious festivals in Greece, older even than the Panathenaea of Athens. They were first celebrated long before temples rose in marble and cities were built of stone. These games had been created in honor of Zeus Lycaos, and though their forms changed over time, their core purpose remained, a way to show reverence and seek the favor of the god who ruled the mountain. Some said the games included foot races, others music, and others dark rites now forgotten or concealed, known only to the priests and the winds that swept the peak. The people of Arcadia carried the stories with quiet pride. They were the guardians of the high place where the king of the gods had once been a child, protected by the nymphs and hidden from danger. They were the ones who knew the truth of Lycaon's sacrifice and the fate that followed. And as the years passed, the trees on Mount Lycaon grew thicker, the paths more worn, and the stories deeper still. But the altar remained, the place where light could not touch, where no shadow dared to fall, and where offerings had been made since the dawn of belief. It was not forgotten. It was not just myth. For those who walked the trails of Arcadia, climbed the sacred peaks, drank from the spring of Hagno, and followed the river Neda to its source, the presence of Zeus Lycaos was still there, watching, waiting, a god of the mountain, the wolf, the storm, and the sacred law, a god whose name echoed through the valleys and was carved in stone long before cities bore their names, and to him they gave their stories, their reverence, and their silence. Neda gives her name to the flowing river, and Hagno to the spring on Mount Lycaos, a spring whose waters do not change with the seasons, for it moves steadily through winter and summer with the same force. Its flow is constant, unfazed by the cold or the heat, and its power was known to be a gift to the people of Arcadia. When the rains stopped for too long, when the ground turned dry and the seeds failed to rise, and the trees began to shrivel under the harsh sun, the people did not lose hope. The priest of Zeus Lycaos, whose task it was to keep the old customs, would come to the sacred spring. He would raise his hands in prayer and speak the ancient words to the water, then make the sacrifices in the proper way, offering what was needed to the god who reigned on high. After the rites, he would take a branch of oak, symbol of Zeus himself, and gently touch the surface of the spring with it, never allowing it to plunge deep. As the branch stirred the water, a mist would rise, first small and thin, then growing thicker as it curled into a pale cloud. The cloud would climb, calling other clouds to it, pulling them from the sky's edges until they gathered overhead. And soon, rain would fall again on the thirsty land of Arcadia, soaking the fields, filling the rivers, and breathing life back into the soil. This was no ordinary spring. It was a channel of the divine, responding not to science but to sacred order. Mount Lycaos held other wonders too. There was a sanctuary of Pan on the mountain, surrounded by a quiet grove of trees, a place where nature seemed to pause in reverence. In front of this grove stretched a racecourse, and there, once long ago, were held the Lycaea Games. Though the games no longer roared with the sounds of runners and crowds, the place remained silent and still, with the bases of old statues marking where once the images of great figures had stood. The statues were gone, but the memory of their presence lingered, etched into the stone and the wind. But of all the marvels on the mountain, the strangest and most feared was the precinct of Zeus Lycaeus. This sacred enclosure was forbidden, surrounded not by walls but by a rule no one dared break. No one, whether beast or man, was allowed to step inside. Those who ignored the warning and crossed the invisible line would not live to see another year. Such was the power that guarded the space, a divine law older than any written one. There was also a strange truth told about that place. Within the precinct, nothing cast a shadow. Not a bird, not a branch, not a person. The sun might shine directly overhead, but no form would leave its mark on the ground. Hunters knew this well. If a fleeing animal ran into the precinct, the hunter would stop at the edge. He could see the beast, but he would notice that it cast no shadow, and that was enough to make him turn away. The shadowless ground was sacred, a sign that even light itself obeyed the rules of the god. It was said that in distant Cyene, near Ethiopia, when the sun stood in the sign of the crab, shadows vanished for a time. But on Mount Lycaeus, it was always so, in every season. No matter the hour or the day, the precinct remained untouched by shadow, and that was how people knew it to be truly holy. At the very top of the mountain stood a mound of earth, an ancient altar to Zeus Lycaeus. From this height, one could see nearly all of the Peloponnesos, stretched out in every direction. It was a place of vision and silence, where sky met earth and the sacred met the real. Before the altar, on the eastern side, stood two tall pillars. Once they had been crowned with golden eagles, glinting in the morning sun, signs of the god's dominion over the skies. Here, in secrecy and without fanfare, sacrifices were made to Zeus Lycaeus. What those rites involved, no one spoke of. The details were hidden by time and reverence, and those who knew did not share them. Some things were not meant for open mouths or curious minds. They belonged to the old ways and stayed that way. Further down on the eastern slope of the mountain stood a sanctuary of Apollo called Parrhasios, another sign that the divine had made a home on this mountain. To the north, beyond the shadowless ground, lay the region of Daisoa. The people there worshipped most dearly the nymph who had given them their name, one of the three who, they believed, had nursed the child god on this very mountain. Daisoa, Neda, and Hatno. They were the caretakers of the god's early days, and each left behind something that bore her memory, a city, a river, a spring. Through them, the mountain was not just a place of worship, but a place of story, of divine upbringing, of origins that shaped the world. Not all who came to this mountain came in peace. Once, a man named Aristocrates betrayed his own people, giving up the Messenians to their enemies, the Spartans. The Arcadians were enraged, and they did not forget. They captured him and stoned him to death for his treachery. They denied him a grave, casting his body beyond the borders of their land, refusing him the dignity of rest. In the precinct of Zeus Lycaeus, they raised a stone tablet that bore harsh and clear words, carved not just in vengeance but in warning, that justice will come in time, that with Zeus's help no betrayal hides forever, and that a man who breaks his oath cannot escape the watchful eyes of the gods. The tablet stood as a testament to divine order, to the belief that even when men forget, the gods remember, and when they choose to act, their judgment is final. Thus, Mount Lycaos remained, silent yet full of voices, empty yet full of memory. It was a place where gods once walked, where waters listened to prayers, where shadows vanished, and where justice was written in stone. Its paths, its springs, its sacred spaces continued to hold the weight of centuries, and its stories whispered still to those who climbed its slopes, seeking not just the views, but the truths carried by the wind. Hail, King Zeus, and keep Arcadia safe. These were the words that carried the prayers of the people to the sky, offered in hope that the one who ruled the heavens would watch over their land, their forests, their cities, and all the sacred mountains where stories and gods were one. Among these stories was that of a boxer named Amarcus from the region of Parasia in Arcadia, whose fame was carved into the history of the Olympic Games. Though his athletic victory was known, tales surrounded him that seemed too wild to believe, except in the hearts of those who remembered the old stories. It was said that during the sacred rites of Zeus Lycaos, he transformed into a wolf. For 9 long years he roamed as a beast, living outside the shape of man, until, according to legend, he became human once again. Some dismissed it as fiction, but in Arcadia, where gods were close and mysteries ran deep, such things were whispered without judgment. The mountains of Arcadia carried these stories in their stone and wind. Among them was Lycaos, standing tall with its shrine to Zeus Lycaos perched near the summit, a place where gods were still honored with the fear and respect of the old world. In the city of Mantinea, the people had not one but several sanctuaries to Zeus. One bore the title Sota, the Savior, a name that gave peace to the people in their daily life. Another was to Zeus Epidotes, the giver of gifts, because he was believed to bring good things to those who gave thanks with pure hearts. These names were not just titles, but truths shaped into form, each one a face of the same God whose power stretched from sky to earth. Near Mantinea there was another sanctuary, this one known for Zeus Carmen. The land around it held oaks of many kinds, some with wide leaves, others known as edible oaks, and another kind whose bark was so light and porous that it was used to make floats for anchors and nets. This bark, called cork by the Ionians, was not just useful but symbolized the blend of nature and worship, showing how even trees bore the mark of the divine. These groves were not mere collections of wood, but sacred places where every leaf and root had its purpose. In the city of Alephera, an altar had been built for Zeus Lachetus, a name meaning in childbed. This was a place of rare myth, where it was believed that Zeus gave birth to Athena. Nearby ran a stream called Tritonis, named after the tale of the river Triton, flowing through the land and carrying with it the memory of divine origins and the myths that wove gods and rivers together. In Gortys, the river that passed through the village was known by 2 names. Near its source, the people called it Lucios, the bathing river, because there it was said Zeus had been washed after his birth. Farther downstream, it took on the name Gortinios, linking it to the land it passed through. The waters of this river were known for their biting cold, colder than any other, as though it carried with it the chill of divine presence. As one travelled near the village of Akakishan, the path to the temple of Despoin passed a marble portico on the right, its wall adorned with white reliefs. There, carved into stone, were the Moirai, the Fates, and beside them stood Zeus, under the name Moiragetes, the guide of fate. Here, destiny was not an abstract thing, but a force shaped by the god's hand, and people walked this road in quiet reverence, aware that their steps were known before they took them. In Tegea, one of the great cities of Arcadia, stood an altar to Zeus Teleos, the full-grown. His image there was square in shape, a form the Arcadians favoured, as though it held a meaning they did not explain but understood in the soul. On a high place within Tegea, where the altars stood close together, was a site known as the place of Zeus Clarios, the god of lots. The name came from an old tale about the sons of Arcas, who cast lots for the division of Arcadia, and this place remembered that moment. The Tegians kept the memory alive through their worship, showing that the god did not only rule from the sky, but also from the hands of those who drew lots and accepted their fate. So Arcadia, with its hills and rivers, its temples and groves, remained a land where Zeus bore many names. Each name told a story. Each altar marked a place where sky and earth touched. From the spring where he was bathed to the river that chilled the hand, from the altar where he guided fate to the grove, where oaks whispered of his gifts. The god was present in form and spirit. His shadow moved across the land not as a single figure but as many, and the people honored him in all those ways, knowing that to speak his name was to remember not just power, but the stories that made the world. Celebrate a feast every year. That was the custom the people held close, a tradition passed down with care, wrapped in stories and rituals that connected them to the gods and to their land. It was more than just a time of food and gathering. It was sacred, a moment where the divine and mortal worlds brushed against one another, where memory was kept alive in prayer and fire. And it was during one of these feasts, under the chill of falling snow, that the strength of this devotion was tested. The Lacedaemonians, fierce and proud warriors from the south, chose that moment to strike. They moved in while the snow blanketed the ground, hoping the feast had made their enemies unguarded, sluggish and unaware. But the weather, though beautiful in silence, betrayed them. The cold sank deep into their bones, and their heavy armor, instead of being their shield, became a burden, clinging to their chilled limbs, making each step harder than the last. They were strangers to this kind of cold, and the snow did not favor them. The Tegeans, however, knew their land. They understood its rhythms and its silence, and though the feast had filled the air with joy and warmth, they were not careless. Quietly, and without letting the invaders see, they built a fire. Flames danced in the shadows, not for celebration now, but for survival and preparation. The fire warmed their hands and hearts. It eased the bite of the snow and readied their bodies. Their armor, too, was made ready, warm to the touch, easy to wear, and quick to move in. So when the time came, they rose not as startled victims, but as warriors shaped by the cold, sharpened by the land they loved. They stepped out into the snow not with fear, but with fire still burning behind their eyes. The cold did not touch them, and the Lacedaemonians, unaware of how prepared their opponents were, met not a scattered feast day crowd, but a force that moved with purpose and fury. The Tegeans fought with the strength that comes not only from practice, but from defending what they knew and cherished. And in that clash, it was not the snow that won, but the people who knew how to live in it. The Tegeans drove the invaders back, their feast undisturbed, their fire still burning. It became one of those moments spoken of again and again, the kind of story parents tell children when snow begins to fall. A tale not just of cleverness and strategy, but of how a people's connection to their land can turn even the harshest weather into an ally. And along that same path between Tegea and Laconia stood silent witnesses to this spirit. On the left side of the road, altars remained, one to Pan, the wild god of the hills and forests, and another to Zeus Lycaios, the one worshipped on the mountain that bore his name. These were not just stones. They were memories carved in place, reminders that gods walked beside men, that the land itself listened and remembered. The altar of Pan stood as a nod to the wildness of nature, the laughter in the trees, and the protection found in the hidden places of the hills. And next to it, the altar of Zeus Lycaios stood for strength, judgment, and the sky that watched over all. Here, in this small stretch of road between two cities, the stories of the gods and the people touched the earth. Every year the feast would return, the snow might fall again, and fires would be lit, not just for warmth, but in memory. The lesson of that day, the strength drawn from quiet preparation and trust in the land, would live on, not only in song or tale, but in the way a fire was built, a road was walked, and an altar was tended with care.